So the first thing I want to do is talk about why we have this session on databases. And it's important to see that there's two almost independent activities that we're very concerned about. One is primary information about the collection that's used in the collection itself. Loans and etc. So lots of information there, but to a certain extent we're even more interested in the way that the collection information can be used. And you know that especially in contexts of allowing people to find out sufficient detail about information that they don't have to either travel to or borrow specimens. That a lot of information can be pre-extracted from the specimens made available generally. But why should we be talking about databases? And I think I want to emphasize that there's a lot of things that will make your life miserable in this context. And so I want to emphasize the things where decisions need to be made and the decisions have impacts that are going to be long-term. So I want to talk about what to store, how to organize information, or how it is organized, give you some examples, and then very important about what things mean once you have them stored. And we're going to have a couple of exercises for you to do some work. All right, so what do we store in the database? We store information about the collection. And those of you who know something about the way GBIF organizes information, you know that GBIF requires a lot of information about collection in order to accept information about specimens or other occurrences. So there's this information about the collection as a whole, and then of course there's information about the specimens. Now, can you read this, Paco? It's okay? So we don't put specimens in databases, right? That's pretty obvious. Grind them up, turn them into bit. No, we're always talking about a digital representation of the specimen. So, and sometimes we forget that it's not. Well, anyway, we'll see this as we go on, how this impacts on the database itself. So we have a digital proxy, something that we kind of think is the specimen from the digital point of view. And then we have properties of that thing. So the record in the primary database that's used for the information management for the collection is a very close relative of the specimen itself. And we think of that as being the specimen, but of course it's not really the specimen. And we can only get a certain small amount of information about the specimen in that digital record. Most of the information about the specimen is in the specimen itself and hasn't been extracted. This is one of the reasons why collections are so important. So we have a jar of 4,000 beetles. We don't know very much about the individuals in that jar, right? But we can represent the jar in the database and say there's a jar of 4,000 beetles. Typically, you have a lot of related information that you're also storing in your database. And the last one on there, taxa, is very important and very difficult, of course, to keep track of. But there's the specimen, and then there's things that are about other things that are about the specimen. In the projects that I've been working on, we're particularly interested in images, two-dimensional images of the specimen. So you have a herbarium sheet, that's the specimen. You have a record in the database that describes that, and you have a picture, and the picture is somehow linked to the specimen. And other things, videos and sounds, etc. And finally, we have the connections from one thing to the next. And this is very often very difficult to represent. And so we have these properties. So an image is the image of something. So there's an image of property or an image of relationship. The specimen has many images. The image is of one specimen. Or an image may be of many specimens, or an image may not be of a specimen at all. If I go out and I take a picture of the garden, it's an image of many specimens in some sense, but it's also a picture of the garden, and it's a record of the state of the garden on this morning. There's a lot of other characteristics of that image besides that it's just a picture of a particular collection of plants. Determined as is a very important relationship. That's the relationship between specimen and taxon. A specimen is determined as a taxon, and we know that that's a relationship that has many values, right? So it was determined as this, and then it was determined as this, and then they changed the name and it became this, etc. And all of that is all parts of this relationship. Same as is very important. One thing is this, one digital record is the same as another, or one, anyway, we'll get more into what same as means later on. And is a part of. You pull a leg off a spider, the leg becomes a part of the whole spider, but an individual object of its own. So we have a lot of records like that in the MorphBank database where they have a spider, and then they take a good image of it and they tear it apart and they take more detailed images of the legs and other pieces. Now, most of you know something about databases probably, relational databases. A relational database is a bunch of tables. Each table has rows and columns. And the three important things that I've pulled out here are the tables, the rows of the tables, and the foreign keys. So a foreign key is a value in one table that refers to something in another table. Everybody understand that? I mean, we'll see this better, I think. But it's like if I write down someone's name, then that's a reference to the person. I have a reference to the person. When I write it down, it's a foreign key. When you have it in your identification in your wallet, it's a primary key, or it's a property of you. So your name is a property of you. When I have your name, it's a foreign property. It's a reference to you. So that's what it's foreign. It's the key of something. Like name is not unique, but your name is a key of you. It's an identifier of you. When I hold it, it's foreign. It's not my name. It's the key of something else. So foreign keys, so this is the next step, is what do these things represent? When we think more conceptually, less in computer terms about things, then we might use terms like the class or kind of a thing, the things themselves, the objects, and the properties of the objects. In relational databases, a table represents a class of things. A row of a table represents a specific object, and a foreign key is a relationship with another object. So the foreign key is a value in a row and column. Okay. Now, information gets organized and divided into tables and rows and columns in databases. And that process of taking primary information about an object and putting it into tables sometimes distorts the information, but it's very important for the databases themselves to be somehow organized. So I think we can look at some examples, and I pulled up some examples here. I hope that this will work. So, for instance, I went to the GBIF data portal. So you go to the GBIF site, you click on Explore the Data Portal. I typed in Colombia and selected something. I guess if I can show you. I selected this first thing, which is an insect. And then I see that there's a lot of information about it. So this is about the taxa. So GBIF has information about taxa. So for this scientific name, we have a lot of information about it. So you can imagine that GBIF somehow has a table of taxa. And the properties of the taxa are things that are shown here. The name, the status, the a globally unique identifier, some feedback about it, etc. So these are all properties. So in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to look at some of these databases and to try and make lists of what the properties are and how they're organized. So we see from this page that GBIF sees things as occurrences, as taxa, right? They are able to show you a map of where that thing is. I think in this case there's only one occurrence. Okay? There's only one occurrence of this particular thing in GBIF, but they show it, that's where it is. Now, if I go further forward and I say I want the occurrences, it takes me to this page, which I'm going to skip over. And then finally I get this instance of a particular object. And that object is organized as though it had several different related things. So it's related to a data set, it's related to a taxonomy, or you could say it has all of these properties, is another way to view it. So this particular occurrence of this taxon came from the Smithsonian Institution in the zoology collection, right? It has kingdom, phylum, class, etc. All of those are properties of this object. And it has some geospatial information, latitude and longitude. So when we see this data, we think there's an organization of this data that's being presented here. They've divided the properties into groups, etc. And that might imply a way that they've structured the data in their database as well. But it's very important to recognize that the database holds the data, a web page presents the data, and you don't have to expose, those two ways of thinking about the data can be completely different. You store it one way in the database, but you show it to people an entirely different way. Now, in the MorphBank database, we see things somewhat differently, and I have it here somewhere. So, on the MorphBank site, morphbank.net, in the entry page, there's a place to type in some term, and it will show you images related to that term. I typed in Colombia again here, and then I clicked down here on this tab that says specimens. Now you can see that then the search for the word Colombia in specimens returns 322 instances of specimens. It looks to me like they're probably all insects. We have a lot of insect records in the MorphBank database. And you can see that even in this brief form of the object, which is just a little bit of detail about the object, there's a lot of properties being represented there. Okay, so there's a lot of properties being represented. And if we look at the detail about this object, this is the detail page. Then the presentation again is dividing things into pieces. So we have things at the top which are about the specimen record. Who gave it to us? When was it presented, etc. That's not information about the specimen at all. Right? It's got really nothing to do with the specimen. That's about the MorphBank record of the information about that specimen. So this is a proxy. It's not directly the specimen. It's something separated from the specimen. Then we have things like a MorphBank number that we put on that specimen. And now we start to get properties of the specimen itself, like basis of record. That's a Darwin core property. This one is a specimen. It should be probably preserved specimen, but in any case, it's that. And we sex and form, and these are Darwin core properties of the object. Similarly, there's some locality here about this object. And then there's a taxonomy, a classification of the object. And at the bottom, we have a number of images. So this particular thing has 7 images in the database associated with this single specimen. And they're presentations of different aspects. So if we were to go and look at one of these, we would see a different presentation of data. We still have the insect, it's the picture of the insect. But now you see that you begin to get properties like magnification and dimension. So those are properties not of the specimen, but of the picture of the specimen. But we also have, down here later on, we have information about the specimen that this is a picture of. So the specimen information is being presented there. The image information is being presented there. So MorphBank sees the data as organized into images and specimens. And we have things like the, there's properties. This is a dorsal angle, for instance. You can see there it's a dorsal angle. That's the presentation of this image. So if you wanted to search for a dorsal of some specific species, you could do that in MorphBank and you might well come up with an image that's a dorsal presentation of that thing. So these properties of what you see when you look at the image are also being stored in the database. Okay. So again, the way that the website presents the image gives you some hints about the way that the organizers of the information in the database store the data. It's really just hints. Okay, so I hope we're at a point where I can ask you to take a couple of minutes and to look at an example of one of these databases and to find a record of a specimen and to look at the properties. So what I'm interested in is, are there any properties that you find unexpected? Now, if you knew what the Darwin core was, I could say, well, pick something that's not Darwin core. But find a property that you find interesting within these collections. And you can work in small groups, 2 or 3 people together, if you will. And well, I'll just give you like 10 minutes, or maybe that's too long, 5 minutes to just look at one of these databases. And I've listed several here. Symbiota, Arctos.org is wrong. There's actually, that's some other site, so don't do arctos.org. But I have some samples here on my, like, Symbiota is symbiota.org. There's the, that's GBIF. There's an Arctos at Harvard. And each of these is a product that's being used by multiple sites to store information about collections. Okay, and any of them are fine. MorphBank you can use. So pick something you like and take a look, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. Now I want to talk a bit about another aspect of organization that you'll see. So some of you may be involved with using the Specify system. And this is a system that's been under development for many years and is being used quite widely and very successfully. But they have a special kind of an object called a collecting event. Now most of you know about collecting events, right? You go out, you get the trap, there's 30,000 insects in it. All the information about how those insects were collected is common. They're all the same. The trap was put there at a certain date, it was taken away at a certain date, it was at a specific location, it was a certain kind of trap, there was a certain collector, etc. All of that is common. So in Specify, you enter that once and you describe it as the collecting event. And so a lot of properties are in the table. It looks something like this. So many specimens are associated with a single collecting event, and properties like latitude, like the latitude property down here is associated with the collecting event. So My question is, does a specimen have a latitude? Of course, right? Of course it does. So the fact that specify puts the latitude in a different table from the specimen doesn't mean that the specimen doesn't have a latitude. You'd say, some people would say, oh no, the specimen doesn't have a latitude. The specimen has a collecting event, and the collecting event has a latitude. That is an artifact of the way they've organized the data. It's not about the information. The specimen definitely was collected at a certain place. So it has those properties. Those are properties of the specimen. So we can't let the database structure confuse us about what the information content is. People who build databases, who design databases, focus on table structure, and it's a mistake. Table structure is the convenient way to store it. It's very easy, it's very convenient in Specify when you begin classifying the specimens to say about, when you have all these properties about where it came from and who collected it, you just say it's part of this collecting event. And that's all you have to do. You don't have to type in the properties. And if it turns out that the collecting event information was wrong, if you update it, it'll update it for all the specimens at once. You don't have to go through, et cetera. So it's convenience, but it doesn't affect what the data means. It affects how easy it is to enter it, how easy it is to modify it, but it doesn't change meaning, and it doesn't change the association between objects and their properties. So if you present this data to GBIF in particular, then you have to take the latitude from the collecting event, attach it to the specimen, and export it. GBIF data model says latitude is a property of specimen and has no notion of collecting event. So Darwin Core is a collection of properties, attributes, that can be used to describe things. So collector name, latitude, date collected, water body, those are properties in Darwin Core. Now, there are some issues in what do they mean. So for instance, if we have the scientific name property, then that typically is the determination of the object. Is that okay? Determination, so somebody has said that's the proper name to be associated with this object. That's scientific name. And that's somebody's best effort to determine. We could think of that as a fact, something that's true. Now, if you look at the phylum property, that's a higher classification, right? You may disagree violently with the phylum. You may say, no, that doesn't belong there at all. I picked phylum, maybe family would be a better one. Anyway, the upper classification of these objects is something that changes all the time, and different people have different versions, and they argue violently about it, right? So you can say scientific name is really a fact about the object, but phylum is something that I would choose to ignore because I'd rather use my classification than somebody else's. So even though there is this property called phylum, we may not accept it as fact. Okay? So even though the properties themselves are always subject to interpretation. And when we're trying to make use of data, we have to be careful about how much credibility or how much confidence we have in each of these properties. And I think most scientists would prefer not to have very much confidence in what GBIF gives us as higher taxonomy. But they may have a lot of confidence in scientific name, much more than, okay? And then of course, the fact that two different specimens have different values for scientific name does not mean necessarily that they're different species. Because names get misspelled, there's synonyms, all kinds of things happen. And so if you have a genus and a specific epithet, and somebody moves the object to a different genus but keeps the specific epithet, then you've got two equivalent names, one with the old genus, one with the new genus. Scientific names are equivalent. So even with something as simple, oh, well, it's not simple, but scientific name is subject to interpretation. If you gather data from GBIF and you want to or group it by species, then you better do some name resolution, right? And GBIF does some also on the incoming side. All right, so then geolocation properties, latitude and longitude, very straightforward, right? It's a place on the Earth. Well, if it's a specimen, then Darwin Core says the specimen is, the latitude and longitude represent the spot that the specimen was collected, right? Now, if you have if it's an occurrence where someone has heard a frog, then you probably have the place where they were standing when they heard the frog. I don't know how far away the frog might be from that. So even that, within a specimen, there's a certain amount of interpretation, right? Then if you take, for example, one of the plants in the garden, what would you say if you think of that as a specimen? It's a living specimen, not a preserved specimen. What latitude and longitude would you associate with that? Where it is, where its native range is. The place in the garden. Typically for live plants, they want to talk about where is the thing now. But for a specimen, you don't want to know the latitude and longitude of the museum where the specimen's located. Okay, so, and it becomes much more complicated. Well, if you think about so of a live organism, it's different. Of an image, if you have a camera that has GPS on it, you shoot the camera, it collects the latitude and longitude and stores it in the image metadata. Is that accurate? If you have a huge telephoto lens and you're shooting several hundred meters away, is the latitude right? So it's representing the position of the camera when the picture was taken. So if you have an image, a museum specimen, is it appropriate to have a latitude and longitude on the picture of a museum specimen? Of a herbarium sheet? No, it doesn't mean anything. Who cares where the picture was taken of a herbarium specimen? Whereas if it's of a plant in nature, then it's more meaningful. And it becomes really complicated with fossils, right? Any of you work with fossils? Well, where you got it doesn't tell you anything about well, it tells you something about the specimen, but not what you want to know. If you're going to do, for instance, distribution analysis or some kind of where was it when it was alive, then where is it now, where did they dig it up, is not the same as where it was when it was deposited. But they want to know age, and they want to know where the rocks were when it was, right? So actually latitude and longitude is good, you record it, but it's not useful for some kind of geographic analysis of the specimens. It is useful, but for a lot of cases, the latitude and longitude doesn't really mean for a fossil what it means for a specimen that was collected live. Similarly, if you collected a specimen of something off a piece of driftwood and it was dead, you wouldn't be able to say where that thing came from if it was on something that was moving. So we have to be real careful about that. When a property is associated with something, it makes a difference. What it means depends on how it's associated. Associated with a specimen, as Darwin Core talks about latitude and longitude of a specimen or an occurrence, an observation, as being the place where that thing was when it was collected or observed. And that's pretty straightforward. But when we move away from specimens or away from current time, then we get into trouble with interpreting specimens. So I'm really saying this as a kind of a caution. And this is the final thing I have to say about databases. So maybe nobody in this room really has this problem, but I've seen a lot of people whose attitude is, I need some technology, let me build it. And the important thing is that these software systems, like MorphBank, now it doesn't work really well, but it does some things pretty well, and et cetera. You know, it's not a perfect system, but it represents an awful large investment. So we had a grant from the National Science Foundation for $2.4 million to do the development of that system. And we spent all those dollars on something. And we spent 4 years in the process. So the idea that you would start from scratch and build something really useful in a short period of time with a small amount of money is just dumb, I guess is the right way of looking at it. Misguided. Specify has been under development for 20 years. And it's gone through, what are they? They're on version 6 now. Every version much better than the last. It's a great tool, and I know that it's being used in Colombia. So it is being adopted, and there's a lot of effort on it. Symbiota is another one that's under lots of development. Arctos, all of these systems. So my advice, of course, is to try and find something that you can use. What happened to my? Oh, not developed here. There's a phrase we use in the U.S. called, everybody, I suppose, not in my backyard, right? Like you want to have a toxic dump site or a prison, or you want it, but you don't want it in your backyard. That's the way I kind of see software maintenance. I want it to be maintained, but I want it to be maintained by somebody else. Let somebody else worry about it and take care of it. So I think of it as not in my backyard software. Get somebody else's software, it's somebody else's problem. I really like to buy into software that is of concern to people who have money. So there's somebody who needs this piece of software who has monetary value associated with it and can afford to develop it, then I like that, because the likelihood is that it's going to get better and better, and if I tie myself to that software, my systems are going to get better and better as well. All right, so that's what I had for databases, so I'd love to answer questions.